The following program is presented by the Metropolitan Library Service Agency.
Hello, welcome to All About Kids, a program focusing on the interests of children and young people and some of the issues affecting them. An issue that concerns parents and educators is keeping children reading. What do we do after kids get out of elementary school, move into junior high and high school? How do we continue to cultivate that love of reading? Our guest today, teacher Sue Keenan, who's with the Minneapolis Public Schools, has some lively and provocative ideas of how to maintain students' interest in reading. We have two young people who are readers. Students in junior high, Angela DeWitt at Valley Middle School in Apple Valley, and Jeremy Johnson at St. Alphonsus School in Brooklyn Center. These two young people will talk a little bit about their reading interests and explain why reading is still important to them. It's a pleasure to have you all here today, and we're going to be talking about one of my very favorite subjects, and I know it's one of yours too, reading and the fun of reading. And Angela, you and Jeremy are both really exceptional readers. You've done a lot of reading this summer and over the past year. And Sue, you're a teacher, and I know that reading is absolutely your passion. So why don't you talk a little bit about your perspective as a classroom teacher and also as a coordinator of a new magnet school?
Okay, as you know, Gretchen, I'm an English teacher, and you're right, reading is my passion, especially children's literature and adolescent literature. And when I'm not reading the latest Paula Danziger or Emmy Kerr, I'm usually a mystery buff. That's what I escape with. And I think that as a classroom teacher, your own love, your own passion for reading just flows out of you and into the students. And I think that's one of the big motivators for getting kids to read. And all the different books that you can bring into the classroom and your enthusiasm about it, I think helps make students like Jeremy and Angela good readers. And also, of course, everything that goes on at home and what you're reading in the home and the access to the books. And the new magnet that you mentioned has to do with students who want to become teachers. So this past year they did a long unit on children's literature and learning how to read out loud, and then bringing it back into the elementary schools where they were working. They were volunteering 3 hours a week.
So you're working with high school students in the magnet who want to become teachers.
Yeah.
Well, Angela, I understand that one of the things that's kind of gotten you really reading a lot is a little bet you have going with one of your teachers. Tell us about that.
Well, if we read more books than she does, our teacher, and she takes us out to eat, and then she'll buy us a bunch of books if we beat her.
Wow. And you beat her last year, right? Now, this was your 6th grade teacher last year, and what's her name?
Miss Legrazi.
So what are some of the kinds of things that you were reading to beat Miss Legrazi?
I had all different types of books. Like, I read science fiction, Madeline Lingle.
Oh, sure. Madeline Lingle has, in fact, she sat right exactly where you are sitting on this very set. She's an exciting author. How many pages did you read? Because that was part of the bet too, wasn't it?
Yeah, I read around 30,000.
Wow. How many books was that then?
I don't know.
You don't know?
like 150 or something.
Wow. And that was over the summer, that was the bet, or for the whole school year?
Just for the school year.
Oh, great.
And you got to choose whatever titles.
Yeah. She had you, we have a bet over the summer too, but I'm not doing that one.
Well, you've been real active this summer, I understand. What are some of the other things that you've been doing this summer besides reading?
I've been swimming, and I played softball, and been camping a lot.
And you went to Boy Scout camp, I understand?
Yeah, with my brother.
So that was fun. Did you do a little reading there, or were there too many other things to do?
Too many other things to do.
Jeremy, what about you? What are some of the things that you like to read?
Well, I like to read adventure stories and war stories a lot. I find those very interesting, and I like to read about history too.
Who are some of your favorite authors?
Some of my favorite authors are I know that I've read a lot of good books about authors like Gary Paulson and Ronald Dahl. He wrote James and the Giant Peach, and that was a very interesting book to read. And that's about it.
What about the other kids in your classes, you two? Are they readers too, or do you think you're kind of in the minority in school today? A lot of kids seem to be too busy to do a lot of recreational reading. Angela?
Nobody reads like
Nobody reads like you do, huh?
But like there is people that read a lot, and some kids don't read because they don't like reading. But then there's lots of kids that read.
Do you guys get together with your friends and say, oh, I just finished this great book, you've got to read it? And then your friends pick it up? Do you kind of have that kind of network going with the kids in your classes?
I've done that once.
Once? What was the book that you recommended?
Hatchet by Gary Paulson.
Oh, isn't that wonderful?
Yeah, but a lot of kids read it already.
Oh, that's a good adventure story.
That sure is.
Gary Paulson, he visited our school a couple of years ago, and that was really fun.
So if you get a chance to see a real author in person, it kind of makes you more interested in reading the books, do you think?
Yeah.
Angela, have you had a chance to meet any real authors? Real authors, that's kind of a silly thing to say. Authors in person.
Well, I met one in second grade, but I don't know who it was. I just remember an author.
I think sometimes the school systems have authors and residents who come and get the kids excited about reading.
Something, I think she said something like, I'm an alligator on Monday or something. I don't know. It's really children's.
Oh, but
author.
it's fun. That kind of thing
That's
can really spark your interest in having that little excitement of getting a chance to ask an author questions about what they read. And that was one of the things that Madeline Lingle talked about, was the letters she gets from young people and talking to young people that encourages her to keep on reading and writing. Sue, I know you have been really passionate in talking with other English teachers about the kinds of books that should be used in junior high classrooms, and the fact that you can teach a novel, the structure of a novel, by using a book that's currently popular with young people as well as with a classic.
Yeah, I think that's real important. I think, there's all different levels of reading, and, the students' ability to read, and kids all come to your classes with different baggage. And I think if we want to have a generation of readers, and some people out in the public say we're not getting that anymore, that these two kids are really, exceptional and above and beyond the norm, that it's real important for the English teacher to take a look at who her clientele are, who are the kids in her class, and then you have to meet their needs and what would they be interested in. And I think that means that the English teachers have to have a real open mind and say, well, okay, I'm not going to teach Tom Sawyer in the 7th grade anymore. I think I'll bring in Cormier's The Chocolate War, and then do Beyond the Chocolate War. And there's so many things you can do with those novels, and I think it's real important that we keep those doors open to the students, that we get them where they are, and then help them along.
It cultivates that enjoyment. Do you two still have reading classes? Do you use textbooks, or do you get to choose the kind of materials you want to read?
We can check, or we can pick what books we want to read, and then this year we do have it if we picked it, or we don't have to take it.
So that's a good thing. And I know you're both strong public library users too, which is always important. I think that connection between the school teacher, the media specialist at the school, and the public library. And you go to the Egan branch of the Dakota County Library. And Jeremy, do you go to Brookdale or Brooklyn Park? What library do you use?
and the Brookdale Hennepin County libraries. And those are really nice libraries.
Lots of choice, lots of variety.
Jeremy, tell us about some of the projects that you do with the books that you've been reading. I overheard a conversation, and you were talking about a really neat project that you did with some of the books you were reading.
Oh, well, one of our projects this year was we had to discuss our book, and we could use poster board or make a model of our book, a character we liked in it, and we put that all together in a report, and we found that very interesting. And then we got to use poster board again to write down some of the things on the poster board and put some pictures of our book on there and write about the author.
I liked the story when you said you were dressing up as the author, and then they worked in pairs interviewing each other.
Yeah.
That's really neat.
A way of bringing books alive and of getting other students interested in the kinds of things you're reading. What kind of things go on in your school, Angela, in terms of promoting reading?
They like just have that bed, and some other teachers do that, and then we do projects on our things, on our books, and we have packets on some of the books that we do, and we have to do vocabulary and stuff on them, and that's like it.
So like a whole kind of integrated approach. What are some of the things that you're doing in your classroom or with the kids besides just the books and the reading?
Lots of read aloud. Lots and lots of read aloud. Some kids still, you know, I still have 16-year-olds. I just did Clown of God by Tommy DePaulo with a class of juniors in the Teaching Magnet. And it was amazing. I don't think it matters how old you are. People still like to be read to. That's such a wonderful book to read aloud. And then we talk about what makes a good read aloud book and what makes a good person to, you know, how do you get it so you can read it aloud and people want to listen and you keep their attention. So we've been doing a lot of that, a lot of art projects. Some of my students were working in the Walkabout program this past summer through the Minneapolis Public Schools, and one of my students was working with a kindergarten class, and she did Sadako and the 1,000 paper cranes and was teaching the little kindergartners how to fold the origami paper cranes, and it was wonderful. And that's, again, talking about bringing those books alive to these students.
Sometimes it's fun to read the kinds of things that you read when you were little and enjoy it again, and that's why even reading picture books with a junior high school student is a wonderful way of recapturing. And you enjoy things at different levels. The artwork and the storyline mean different things.
That's right. I think that's the most important thing you can do is the lap reading, just to instill that love of language and the love of the sound of words, and then, you know, then the whole world is open after you get them turned on to that.
You two probably remember being read aloud to when you were little, do you? Yeah. That's what really got you into it. So before you started school, you knew all the fairy tales and the folk tales. And
we knew a lot of those, but I really got into reading last year with those reports we did, and which were a lot of fun.
I think you should say that again. Those reports were a lot of fun, huh?
Yeah.
It made reading fun for you, doing those, huh?
Yeah.
That's great.
What other things do you like in school, Angela? What are some of your other favorite classes?
Oh, I like math and science.
That's a good combination, a well-rounded student. How about you, Jeremy?
I like social studies, English, and science.
And that's where your enjoyment of history comes in with the social studies. Sue, I know you've had some real interesting networking with other teachers in your system to encourage the social studies teachers or even the science teachers to read little bits and pieces. How does that go over with the faculty? Do they see reading as a part of their ordinary curriculum?
I think they're beginning to more and more. I think in the last few years, we've really seen an integration of the subject matters. You know, when you get into secondary, we're so boxed into 55 minutes of English and 55 minutes of social studies. And I think the pendulum is starting to swing back, where the English teacher's teaming with the social studies teacher or with the science teacher. And so I think they're becoming more, I don't know if I want to say willing or ready to say, oh yeah, I'm not just going to teach this, you know, this science experiment. We're going to go off and maybe read a Gary Paulson story about the environment. So I'm seeing them doing that more and more and more. And of course, the literature right now is saying that students need writing across the curriculum, and that's real important, that it's not just up to the English teacher in 50 minutes.
Do you two find that it's easier to write your reports because you are such readers, that you've got a better style and it's more fun to write than it is? Yeah, I think that's something I always found out. Angela, I understand that you have read the complete works of Willa Cather. Now that's really something for a young woman your age. What got you interested in Willa Cather?
Well, my mom and my dad used to live in the same town she lived in. She was little, and so
it was kind of going back in your own family's history, sort of, to find out. It's been a long time since I've read any Willa Cather. That kind of makes me interested in picking up one of her books again and reading it. It sounds to me like you two are reading some adult titles rather than just the usual young adult novels or the adolescent kinds of things. You mentioned John Steinbeck, that you've enjoyed John Steinbeck.
Yeah.
Did you read The Red Pony?
Yeah, The Red Pony.
Red Pony?
Yeah.
That real tearjerker, but a wonderful book. What are some of the other authors that you enjoy, Angela?
well, Madeline Lingle, and I like Frances Pascal.
Oh, yes, yes, she has some good, now she's a young adult.
And
I like her too.
And Stephen King.
Scary books, Stephen King, scary books. Have you read Stephen King too?
I've heard of him, yeah.
I think
the
probably
books.
among the young adults who use the Hennepin County Library, Stephen King is definitely one of the most popular
He certainly
authors.
is.
And you would use him in a classroom, wouldn't you, Sue?
Yeah, I would recommend, if that's what the student wants to read, I think that's great. There's a lot of times you get complaints, oh, my son won't read anything except for The Outsiders. I hear that quite a bit, and I think that's great. Let them just master the reading, and they'll move on. They'll go on to other things. I had one student that read The Outsiders all year long. It was the only book he read, and I think he must have read it 25 or 30 times, and I'd shove little titles. Well, you might like this one too, but he needed to binge on The Outsiders, and I think that's real important that we allow students to do that binge reading. It's
the same thing that parents read the same picture books over and over to very young children. Obviously, it's meeting some kind of a need, and the same thing could be for young adults too.
That's right.
I know a lot of adults who go back every year or so and reread some of their favorite books, and every time you get something different out of it.
That's right.
So what kinds of things are you going to look for this year in school?
Well, I want to go out for swimming and tennis and softball.
Oh, that's good. That'll cut into your reading time a little bit, won't it?
I don't know. It's always funny. I think people who are readers always find time to read. It's amazing. You can always fit it into your schedule. Jim Trulli says at the breakfast table or whatever, that extra half hour at night. What about you, Jeremy?
Well, this year, besides reading, I'm going to get into some school soccer.
Sue, I bet you could give a bit of advice to parents or to teachers or to students.
I guess it would be to read aloud. I've decided that for me, that seems to work the best, to motivate students to read. And then to share book titles. I don't think kids do that too much. We know about the old paperback syndrome among junior high school kids, that they don't want a hardcover book and they want to shove that paperback deep into their pocket so nobody knows that they have it. And I think you two need to be leaders and say, wow, this is a great book. I just read, Hatchet or one of Madeline Lingle's books. And get your friends out there, because you have a lot more pull than somebody like me standing in front of an English class saying, oh, this book is wonderful, you have to read it. But if they heard it from you, we'd have a whole nation of readers.
One of the things some of our librarians have been doing this summer is keeping notebooks in the children's area and just asking young people to write down titles and maybe one or two words on why they enjoyed the book, and kids didn't even have to sign their names. And I was at the Minnetonka Library last week, and people were absolutely pawing through those, looking. They trust you more than they trust us. One of the other funny things, though, as a librarian, if a classroom teacher starts reading aloud, and it can be an old book, a rebound book that hasn't circulated for a long time, but if a teacher starts reading it, we'll have that whole class in the public library after school wanting to read that book. You've got a lot of clout, too.
That is wonderful. I love it. I was reading one of Marguerite Henry's books to my 7th graders, and I had a student that she loved to read. She was a wonderful reader. And I started reading it, and that's exactly what she did, Gretchen. She ran right out to the Roosevelt Library. So I have to have this. I have to finish. It's going to take her forever to finish this book.
But she'll beat you to finish it.
That's right. So she just quickly hopped on a bus and headed over to the Roosevelt Library.
Well, that's a good thing. The public library, the school media specialist, your English teacher, and sharing the kinds of titles that you like the best with your colleagues at school. And I also think for teachers to pass titles
That's
around.
right.
Teachers to be role models and carry books around, and even to say to a classroom, hey, I'm just reading this book and I really enjoyed it. Or walk into a classroom and see the teacher sitting there reading a book. That would be wonderful.
That's right.
Walk into the public library and see a librarian reading a book. It has been a pleasure having you all on All About Kids today. You're dynamic young people, and it's a pleasure to know two people who read as much as you do. Thank you for being with us, and thank you very much, Sue.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Storytelling is another way of continuing to foster an enjoyment of books, words, language, and reading in young people. Anne Hallgren from the St. Paul Public Library is going to share with us one of her favorite stories, Grandmother's Apron, a quilt story.
About 70 years ago, John was a little boy growing up in the city. His grandmother and grandfather lived on a farm, and every summer John went to live with them for a few weeks. Each morning before starting work, Grandfather pulled on his overalls and Grandmother put on an apron. Most of Grandmother's aprons were of white cloth, but some of Grandmother's aprons were made of colorful, bright cloth. One morning, John was very angry because it was raining outside and he couldn't go out and play. "When is the sun going to come out?" John said. "I want to go out and play." Well, Grandmother smiled, and she said, "I will make you a playhouse where many suns will shine all day long." So Grandmother took 2 chairs and placed them a few feet apart. Then she took off her apron, which was made of blue cloth with a yellow sun shining all over it. She draped the apron over the top of the 2 chairs and made a cozy little playhouse. John crawled in the playhouse and played happily the rest of the day. The next morning, the sun was shining again, and Grandmother wore a plain white apron. Later that morning, it was time to collect the eggs, and Grandmother asked John to come and help her. Together, the 2 of them walked down to the hen house. Grandmother gathered her apron up in one hand to form a basket, and with the other hand, she reached into the nests and put the eggs into the basket. Sometimes Grandmother had to reach underneath one of the fat hens and pull out the eggs to put into the basket. "I want to try that," said John. So he took his small hand and stuck it under a big, fat, white hen, and that white hen snapped at him with her sharp beak. Well, that scared John so much that he took and he threw the eggs into Grandmother's apron basket. Well, all the eggs in the basket broke, and the yellow yolks ran all over her apron. Later that day, Grandmother tried to wash the yellow yolks out of the apron, but they wouldn't come out. "Well," said Grandmother, "I've always wanted a yellow apron." So she dyed the apron yellow. One afternoon, Grandmother, Grandfather, and John went for a walk in the woods. They came upon a patch of ripe, wild strawberries. "I wish I'd brought my berry basket," said Grandmother. "Then we could have picked some of these berries and taken them home with us." "But you have a basket, Grandmother," said John, and he pointed to her white apron. So they picked some berries, put them in Grandmother's apron basket, and carried them home. But when they dumped the berries out of Grandmother's apron basket, they noticed that some of the juice had run out of the berries, and now parts of Grandmother's apron was pink. "Well," said Grandmother, "a pink apron might be just as nice," so she dyed the apron pink. One Sunday afternoon, they went on a picnic, but they forgot to bring the old blanket to sit on, and the grass was crawling with ants and bugs, and John didn't want to sit down on the ground and have the picnic. "We'll use this as a blanket," said Grandmother as she spread her fancy Sunday white apron on the ground. After they finished their picnic, they picked up the apron, and they noticed that it was covered with green grass stains. Said Grandmother. "A green apron might be just as pretty." So Grandmother took the apron home and dyed it green. On the 4th of July, Grandmother and John went into town to watch Grandfather march in the 4th of July parade. Many other people were waving small flags at the people in the parade. "I wish I had a flag to wave," said John. "Then I could wave it at Grandfather when he marches by." Grandmother smiled, and she took off her red, white, and blue apron and gave it to John to wave in the parade. When Grandfather marched by, Grandmother and John waved the biggest flag at him. Every Saturday morning, Grandfather polished his shoes. He would sit out on a bench in the front yard, put a small amount of shoe polish on his shoes, take a soft cloth, and buff them until they shone. One day, Grandfather sent John into the house to ask Grandmother for a shoe polishing rag. John ran into the kitchen to look for Grandmother, but he couldn't find her anywhere. But he knew where she kept the cleaning rags, so he went to the drawer, opened it up, and pulled out a big white rag. He ran outside and gave it to Grandfather, and Grandfather took it and didn't open it to see what it was. He took and polished his shoes until they were a nice shiny brown, and then he did the same with John's. Well, just when he finished shining John's shoes, Grandmother came out and said, "What are you doing to my nice white apron?" John looked at Grandmother and said, "I thought it was a rag. I got it from your rag drawer, Grandma." Well, at first, Grandmother looked very annoyed, and then she smiled, and then she laughed and said, "One can always use a good brown apron." So she dyed the apron brown. John loved to go barefoot. In town, he had to wear shoes, but when he was on the farm, he could go barefoot all he liked. But sometimes John wasn't very careful and didn't watch where he was going. One day, he stepped on a sharp piece of glass and cut his foot. He ran crying to Grandmother, who quickly took off her white apron and wrapped it around his foot. She carried him to the house, cleaned his cut, and put a Band-Aid on it. Then she put him in the rocking chair in the kitchen and told him stories the rest of the day while she cooked supper. Later that day, when Grandmother looked at her apron, there were red stains all over the white apron. She said, "I suppose I could boil and soak the stains out, but I've always wanted a red apron." So Grandmother dyed the apron red. All too soon, it was time for John to go home. He looked forward to going back home and telling his mom and dad everything that happened on the farm. It was a long ride into town. They had to go by horse and buggy. It got dark and it got cold, and John shivered. So Grandmother took off her nice, fancy blue going-to-town apron and wrapped it around John's shoulders. By the time they reached John's house in town, he was fast asleep. As the years went on, John got older, he got married, had children, and had grandchildren of his own. His grandmother and grandfather got older, and they died, but John never forgot them. John loved to barbecue hot dogs and hamburgers for his grandchildren, and he always wore one of Grandmother's big white aprons. But best of all, John loved to tell his grandchildren stories. He would tuck them in bed at night under a nice patchwork quilt, and he would point to the different squares in the quilt and tell them stories about when that piece was a part of Grandmother's aprons. He would tell them about the times when Grandmother would make a nice playhouse with many suns shining. He would tell them different stories about when Grandmother had just plain white aprons that she wore. He told them the story about how he got bit by a hen and he broke all the eggs in Grandmother's apron basket. He told them the story about when they went picking berries in the woods. He told them the story about when they went on a picnic and didn't have a blanket to sit on. He told them a story about when he used Grandmother's apron as a flag to wave at Grandfather in the 4th of July parade. He told them about the time that he and Grandfather got in trouble when they used one of Grandmother's nice white aprons to polish their shoes. He also told them the story about when he cut his foot on a piece of glass and Grandmother used her apron. He also told them the story about when he would go home from the farm and he'd get cold and Grandmother would wrap her nice blue apron around his shoulders. Now everybody in our story is sound asleep, and it's time for us to leave them quietly and say good night. Grandmother's Aprons, A Quilt Story, is one of many stories taken from Anne Pulowski's book, The Family Storytelling Handbook.
Thanks to our guests today, Sue Keenan, Angela DeWitt, and Jeremy Johnson, and thanks to Anne Hallgren from the St. Paul Public Library. And thank you for joining us on All About Kids. Please tune in again.
This has been a presentation of Hennepin County Library in conjunction with the Twin Cities Metropolitan Library Service Agency.